This is a true horror story about a deeply unsettling real experience that fundamentally shattered my perception of the physical world, proving that the most terrifying anomalies do not always hide in the dark, but are sometimes attached directly to us in the light. Most people casually browse the internet late at night looking for a fictional scary story to give themselves a brief, highly entertaining thrill before safely drifting off to a peaceful sleep, completely secure in the undeniable belief that the immutable laws of earthly physics will always remain perfectly intact. We inherently trust gravity to keep us anchored to the ground, we completely trust the sun to rise every single morning, and we absolutely, unquestionably trust that our own shadows are nothing more than a harmless, physical absence of light perfectly mirroring our every biological movement. But when that supposedly unbreakable, fundamental law of reality is inexplicably and silently breached by something impossible, it rapidly transforms into a waking nightmare that permanently poisons your existence. I have always worked late, exhausting evening shifts at a small, deeply isolated data processing center located in the quiet, industrial outskirts of a sprawling suburban town. My daily routine was incredibly mundane and entirely predictable, usually ending with a long, lonely, completely silent walk back to my empty apartment at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. I generally enjoyed the peaceful, heavy isolation of the late-night commute, finding a strange, quiet comfort in the deserted concrete sidewalks and the towering, ancient pine trees that entirely swallowed the distant, ambient noise of the sleeping city. It was a bitterly cold, completely windless Tuesday night in the absolute middle of November when the dark, creeping impossibility first actively infected my reality. The ambient temperature had aggressively plummeted significantly below freezing just after midnight, leaving a thick, glittering layer of heavy white frost completely coating the dead grass and parked cars along the quiet residential street. The long, winding road leading to my apartment complex was heavily illuminated by a perfectly spaced row of towering, harsh, orange sodium streetlights, casting long, deep, highly defined shadows that slowly stretched and shrank as I methodically walked beneath them. I was completely, deeply exhausted, my heavy winter boots loudly crunching against the frozen pavement, my dry, burning eyes desperately focused entirely on the distant, warm glow of my apartment building. At first, I ignored it. I was passing directly underneath a flickering, buzzing streetlight, casually watching my dark, elongated shadow naturally stretch out across the frozen asphalt directly in front of me, when a highly subtle, deeply microscopic anomaly occurred. I abruptly stopped my physical forward momentum to adjust the heavy, slipping strap of my canvas work bag. I stood perfectly, rigidly still in the freezing winter air. But something felt wrong. Deeply, fundamentally, and impossibly wrong about the exact, highly specific way the dark silhouette resting on the concrete reacted to my sudden halt. It was incredibly brief, a fraction of a single, highly pressurized second, but my exhausted brain clearly registered that the dark shadow stretching across the ground did not stop moving at the exact, microscopic instant my physical boots stopped walking. It seemed to take an extra, highly unnatural millisecond to fully process my lack of motion, its dark, featureless head subtly drifting forward just a few inches before abruptly, rigidly snapping perfectly back into its proper, static alignment. I stood completely frozen on the quiet sidewalk, my frantically beating heart skipping a violent, agonizing beat before completely stalling in my tight, cramping chest. I stared intensely, blankly down at the dark shape on the asphalt, my cold, pale breath forming thick, highly visible white clouds of freezing condensation in the heavy, silent air. I desperately, pathetically tried to rationally explain the terrifying visual anomaly away using cold, hard, earthly logic. I forcefully convinced my rapidly fracturing mind that I was simply experiencing a severe, highly localized visual hallucination directly caused by my extreme sleep deprivation, the harsh, heavily distorted angle of the flickering orange streetlight, and the natural, heavy exhaustion weighing down my tired eyes. It was a completely harmless optical illusion, a shadow lag caused by a tired brain misinterpreting visual data in the dark. I let out a long, violently trembling, completely exhausted sigh of pure, manufactured relief, entirely believing that my paranoid mind was simply playing cruel tricks on me in the isolated silence. I slowly, carefully resumed my long walk home, completely refusing to look down at the ground for the entire remainder of the freezing journey, desperately hoping that a long, peaceful night of undisturbed sleep would entirely reset my fragile, human perception. But the profound, creeping, ice-cold dread had already begun to pool heavily in the very bottom of my empty stomach, entirely paralyzing my ability to easily dismiss the encounter. Over the following, agonizing nights, the deeply unsettling, impossible delay actively began to become significantly, terrifyingly more noticeable, establishing a dark, highly methodical pattern that violently attacked my remaining sanity. I found myself becoming entirely, completely obsessed with aggressively checking the dark reflections and shadows cast by my physical body, my violently trembling head constantly, frantically snapping down to observe the asphalt whenever I walked beneath the glowing street lamps. The terrifying, impossible details slowly, methodically began to aggressively emerge from the dark, static void, permanently destroying any remaining hope of a logical, earthly explanation. I noticed, with a sickening, freezing drop in my stomach, that the shadow was consistently, undeniably finishing my physical movements late. When I would slowly, deliberately reach out my heavy, gloved hand to push open the thick glass door of my apartment lobby, the dark, elongated shadow of my arm cast against the brick wall would slowly, lazily extend, its dark, spindly fingers arriving at the reflected door handle a distinct, highly visible fraction of a second completely after my actual, physical hand had already made solid contact with the cold metal. It felt exactly, terrifyingly as if the dark silhouette was not a passive, natural reflection of light, but a highly advanced, deeply paranormal, completely impossible physical entity actively processing and mimicking my biological actions on a terrifying, heavy delay. The intense, overwhelming feeling of being intimately, malevolently watched completely saturated my fragile soul, an immense, crushing barometric pressure that violently anchored me to my own terrifying, absolute helplessness. The shadow occasionally twitched after I had completely, perfectly stopped moving. I would stand perfectly, statuesquely still in the long, dark, highly illuminated central hallway of my apartment building, entirely holding my tight, cramping breath, and the heavy, featureless dark shape resting against the pale plaster wall would suddenly, violently vibrate, exactly like a tense, highly predatory animal desperately trying to maintain a forced, uncomfortable stillness. It was a terrifying, undeniable confirmation that the dark space directly attached to my physical heels was actively harboring an independent, unblinking anomaly that was struggling to perfectly synchronize its massive, unseen presence with my own fragile, terrified life force. That was when I noticed it. The profound, psychological dread violently shifted from the isolated, outdoor commute completely into the supposedly safe, waking reality of my own private home. The heavy, stagnant atmosphere inside my locked, secure apartment suddenly felt incredibly, impossibly oppressive, a dense, static void that actively squeezed the precious oxygen right out of my lungs. I began to realize that even the natural, comforting reflections in my own bathroom mirror seemed slightly, terrifyingly out of sync. When I stood perfectly still before the glass, staring deeply into my own exhausted, bloodshot eyes, the faint, heavy shadow actively cast on the shower curtain directly behind my reflection did not perfectly match my physical posture. I would slowly, carefully turn my heavy head to the left, and the dark silhouette in the mirror would remain perfectly, rigidly facing forward for a single, highly pressurized moment before smoothly, mechanically gliding into the correct, mirroring position. I still can't explain it. The immutable, unbreakable laws of earthly physics had completely, violently collapsed inside the enclosed, isolated environment of my own life. I became entirely, completely consumed by a raw, screaming, animalistic paranoia, a heavy, hypnotic obsession that actively commanded me to constantly, aggressively test the impossible boundaries of the dark attachment. I spent endless, agonizing hours moving methodically under the harsh, flickering streetlights in the empty parking lot, executing highly sudden, chaotic, unpredictable physical movements, desperately trying to catch the dark entity completely off guard. I would sprint at full, frantic speed across the frozen asphalt and then abruptly, violently drop to my freezing knees, entirely watching in pure, unadulterated primal terror as the heavy, dark shadow forcefully overshot my physical position, its dark, elongated mass sliding several feet past my resting body before violently, aggressively snapping back to reconnect with my kneeling form. The heavy, pressurized silence of the isolated nights aggressively swallowed the frantic, uneven, terrified gasps actively escaping my pale lips as I desperately tried to maintain my fragile, clinging sanity in the face of absolute, reality-breaking impossibility. One freezing, completely windless Thursday night, the impossible, mind-shattering reality violently escalated into a terrifying new phase. I was standing perfectly, rigidly still on my small, dark outdoor balcony, staring blankly out at the sleeping, abandoned city, entirely illuminated by a single, harsh, pale yellow porch light mounted directly above my heavy head. The light cast a sharp, incredibly defined, deep black shadow directly onto the smooth concrete floor of the balcony. I was facing completely, perfectly forward, looking out over the metal railing, when I slowly, agonizingly glanced down at the dark shape resting silently at my feet. The deeply sickening, massive, heavy, toxic realization instantly and violently slammed directly into my chest exactly like a massive, heavy iron sledgehammer. For a single, microscopic, entirely fatal split second, the heavy, dark shadow cast on the concrete was absolutely not facing forward. It was facing entirely, perfectly backward, its dark, featureless head completely turned to stare intensely, malevolently directly up at my own terrified, physical face. The highly unnatural, impossible posture lasted for only a fraction of a heartbeat before the dark silhouette violently, smoothly twisted back into the correct, forward-facing orientation, but the terrifying, absolute visual confirmation had permanently, violently been recorded in my exhausted brain. The shadow sometimes faced the completely wrong direction, an ancient, unblinking watcher temporarily forgetting to maintain the complex, heavy illusion of physical conformity. I practically sprinted entirely back inside my freezing apartment, violently slamming the heavy glass sliding door entirely shut and completely engaging the heavy brass lock with a loud, echoing click. I collapsed heavily onto my worn living room couch, completely pulling my trembling knees tightly to my chest, entirely consumed by a claustrophobic, psychologically oppressive dread that violently anchored my freezing body to the spot. I desperately, pathetically needed to physically prove to myself that I was not completely, hopelessly losing my mind. I needed undeniable, physical, digital evidence that the terrifying, impossible delay was actually, physically happening in the waking world, and not just entirely a product of my severe, deeply unbroken sleep deprivation. I slowly, agonizingly pushed myself up from the dark couch, my violently shaking legs feeling exactly like heavy, unyielding solid lead. I walked meticulously into the absolute dead center of the empty living room and completely turned on the harsh, bright, single overhead light fixture, actively casting a sharp, incredibly deep, highly defined black shadow directly against the blank, pale plaster of the opposite wall. I pulled my glowing smartphone entirely out of my heavy pocket, my clammy, violently sweating fingers gently resting exactly on the smooth glass screen. I carefully, methodically propped the digital camera perfectly upright against a heavy stack of books. Resting on the wooden coffee table, angling the highly sensitive lens to perfectly, flawlessly capture both my own physical, standing body and the towering, dark silhouette cast against the wall behind me. I pressed the bright red digital record button, the small, glowing timer silently ticking forward in the dead, heavy silence of the isolated room. I slowly stepped perfectly into the center of the illuminated frame. I stood perfectly, rigidly still for exactly 10 agonizing, heavily pressurized seconds, actively listening to the frantic, uneven hammering of my own trapped heartbeat. Then, it happened again. I began to execute a series of highly deliberate, sharp, carefully measured physical movements. I slowly, aggressively raised my right arm entirely above my heavy head. I paused. I forcefully stepped exactly one pace to the left. I paused. I violently, suddenly turned my physical body completely to the right. I stopped abruptly, holding the awkward, tense posture for several long, suffocating seconds before completely relaxing my exhausted muscles. I slowly walked entirely out of the digital frame, my trembling hand reaching out to gently stop the video recording. The silence inside the apartment was deafening, a thick, stagnant void that completely lacked any natural, comforting background noise. I sat heavily back down onto the dark couch, the harsh, pale blue light from the glowing digital screen heavily illuminating my pale, sweating, completely terrified face in the pitch-black darkness of the room. I opened the video file, my dry, burning eyes completely locked onto the small, bright rectangle. I played the recorded footage entirely through at completely normal, regular speed. At first, the video looked deeply weird but highly ambiguous. The dark shadow on the white wall definitely seemed slightly sluggish, highly unnatural, and deeply off-kilter, but the movement was so incredibly fast that it was practically impossible to definitively prove without a single shadow of a doubt. I needed to see the exact, microscopic mechanics of the impossible interaction. I paused the glowing video exactly at the absolute beginning of my first physical movement, the exact moment I had raised my right arm. I placed my violently trembling thumb directly onto the smooth digital slider at the bottom of the screen. I began to slowly, meticulously, and agonizingly scrub the recorded timeline forward, moving the high-definition footage exactly frame by single, highly pressurized frame. I watched the static image of my own physical, exhausted body standing perfectly still in the harsh light. I advanced the video one frame. Nothing. I advanced the video a second frame. Nothing. I advanced the video a third frame, completely preparing to watch my physical arm finally, slowly begin to lift, fully expecting to see the dark shadow cast on the wall react a fraction of a second later, entirely confirming my terrifying theory of the shadow lag. But the terrifying, mind-breaking, absolute final impossibility aggressively revealed itself on the glowing screen, completely and permanently destroying the last clinging fragments of my human sanity. I stared deeply, helplessly into the flawless, high-definition digital playback, my tight, cramping lungs completely failing to draw a single, natural breath. As I slowly dragged the timeline forward, entirely focused on the exact moment of physical initiation, the horrifying truth violently shattered my reality. The dark, towering silhouette cast against the pale plaster wall absolutely did not move after my physical body. As I advanced the timeline to the exact frame right before my actual, physical muscles ever twitched, the shadow in the video smoothly, deliberately, and highly mechanically began to raise its dark, elongated arm. I sat perfectly, rigidly still in the freezing dark, staring blankly at the impossible, frozen image, completely realizing with a massive, soul-crushing dread that the dark entity was absolutely not lagging behind my actions. It was actively, patiently leading them, entirely pulling the invisible, heavy strings of my physical reality from the dark, static void, and the digital recording undeniably proved that my shadow moves before I do. The fragile, pathetic illusion of earthly safety that I had desperately constructed to protect my rapidly fracturing mind completely and violently collapsed over the following 48 agonizing hours, entirely transforming my mundane existence into a suffocating, waking nightmare. Living through a deeply unsettling real experience permanently strips away your comforting biological denial, violently forcing you to accept that the immutable, unbreakable laws of physical reality are actively decaying right in front of your wide, unblinking eyes. The deeply terrifying, initial realization that my shadow was lagging a fraction of a second behind my physical movements had been a massive, freezing shockwave of pure primal dread, but I had desperately, foolishly tried to rationalize it away as a severe, sleep-deprived optical illusion or a bizarre trick of the shifting ambient light. But the deeply sickening, impossible delay became fundamentally, absolutely impossible to ignore. The gap between my physical actions and the dark, projected silhouette completely anchored to my feet was actively, methodically growing wider, aggressively stretching from a microscopic, barely perceptible hesitation into a full, heavy, terrifying second of impossible lag. I would slowly, deliberately raise my pale, violently trembling hand to my face, holding my breath in the stagnant indoor air, and I would have to wait for an agonizing, heavily pressurized beat before the dark, featureless arm cast against the pale plaster wall would smoothly, mechanically mimic the exact same motion. But that wasn't the worst part. The true horror story violently escalated as the impossible, dark anomaly began to aggressively bleed into the mundane, physical reality of my isolated apartment, bringing with it a highly toxic, heavy barometric pressure that actively squeezed the precious oxygen right out of my tight, cramping lungs. I noticed with a massive, freezing drop in my empty stomach that the shadow was beginning to retain its own terrifying, unnatural momentum. I would be nervously, quickly pacing across the cold hardwood floorboards of my living room, my rapid, terrified breath forming chaotic clouds of condensation in the dropping ambient temperature, and when I abruptly, violently stopped in the absolute center of the room. My shadow would not. The dark, heavy projection would take an extra, highly deliberate, completely silent half-step forward on the wooden floor before finally, seamlessly freezing into place, exactly as if it was a physical, heavy body actively struggling to arrest its own forward inertia. It was a completely, fundamentally wrong, deeply sickening anatomical disaster that actively rejected the natural, earthly laws of light and physical matter. I still can't explain it. My frantic, completely exhausted brain desperately sought any logical, earthly anchor in the rapidly escalating nightmare, but the heavy, static environment actively worked against my survival. The strange, impossible occurrences aggressively expanded beyond just the dark projection on the floor. I began to notice deeply disturbing, highly subtle anomalies actively corrupting the reflective surfaces of my safe sanctuary. The reflections occasionally failed to match my physical movements with the exact same, terrifying delay. I would stand perfectly, rigidly still in front of the cold bathroom mirror, the harsh, sickly overhead fluorescent light aggressively illuminating my pale, heavily sweating face, and when I slowly blinked my dry, burning eyes, the dark reflection staring intensely back at me would remain perfectly, flawlessly unblinking for a fraction of a second too long, its hollow, bottomless, dark voids actively observing my vulnerability before finally, mechanically closing its eyes. The heavy, pressurized silence of the isolated apartment became completely deafening, a thick, static void that actively swallowed the natural, comforting background noises of the city. Then it happened again. The physical environment itself began to violently react to the massive, highly unnatural presence actively occupying the dark space. I slowly, meticulously walked down the long, narrow central hallway, and the precise microscopic second my increasingly distorted, heavy shadow stretched across the peeling plaster wall, the bright overhead lights violently flickered. It wasn't a normal, electrical power surge, the glass bulbs emitted a low, continuous, deeply irritating mechanical hum that aggressively vibrated against my highly sensitive inner eardrums, the pale light rapidly dimming and aggressively flaring exactly as if the dark, towering entity was actively, forcefully draining the electrical energy from the physical wires to sustain its impossible, unblinking existence. Every single time the dark silhouette grew slightly darker, slightly more defined, the lights would violently sputter and die for a fraction of a second, plunging the suffocating corridor into absolute, pitch-black darkness. The intense, overwhelming paranoia entirely consumed my fragile soul, a massive, crushing weight that completely anchored my trembling body to a constant state of raw, screaming, animalistic fear. The deep, heavy dread actively forced me to aggressively avoid any and all sources of bright, direct illumination. I slowly, methodically became a silent, paranoid prisoner entirely within my own home, completely desperate to avoid casting the dark, terrifying anomaly. I meticulously unscrewed the bright overhead bulbs in the kitchen and the living room, leaving the sprawling, isolated apartment completely swallowed by a heavy, dense, comforting twilight. I completely stopped looking into the bathroom mirrors, covering the thick glass with dark, heavy winter towels, entirely terrified of what patient, unblinking entity might be staring back at me from the cold digital ether. I forcefully drew the heavy, thick blackout curtains completely across the large living room windows, absolutely refusing to let the pale, sickly glow of the distant street lamps cast my long, distorted reflection across the floorboards. The isolation became absolute, a heavy, static vacuum that actively tore my remaining sanity into tiny, irreparable shreds. The severe, completely unbroken sleep deprivation actively began to deeply hallucinate my exhausted mind, blurring the heavy, distinct line between waking reality and the dark, suffocating nightmares actively invading my safe bedroom. But the mundane, physical demands of earthly survival eventually, violently forced me to leave my dark sanctuary. I desperately needed basic groceries, my empty stomach violently churning with a sickening, hollow pain. Late one freezing, completely windless Thursday night, I heavily bundled myself in a thick, dark winter coat and quietly slipped out into the bitter, biting chill of the abandoned city streets. The ambient temperature had plummeted significantly below freezing, completely trapping the isolated neighborhood in a dead, heavy, winter silence. I walked quickly and silently, entirely keeping my head heavily bowed, my wide, completely terrified eyes strictly locked onto the wet, freezing concrete sidewalk, absolutely refusing to look at the harsh pools of pale yellow light cast by the towering street lamps. But even in the public, waking world, the deeply terrifying reality of this scary story aggressively pursued me. As I stood in the quiet, heavily illuminated aisle of a small, empty 24-hour convenience store, bathed in the harsh, flickering glare of the overhead fluorescent tubes, I clearly, undeniably noticed the terrifying reactions of the few other late-night customers. Strangers would casually walk past me, their tired, exhausted eyes naturally sweeping across the brightly lit aisle, and they would suddenly, violently freeze. I saw a middle-aged woman carrying a plastic basket completely stop in her tracks, her relaxed posture suddenly turning completely rigid. She stared intensely, completely blankly, not at my pale, sweating face, but directly, intimately at the empty physical space on the linoleum floor entirely behind my back. She blinked rapidly, a look of pure, unadulterated confusion and deep, creeping dread aggressively washing over her features, before she quickly turned around and practically sprinted down the opposite aisle. The terrifying, mind-breaking realization instantly froze the hot blood circulating in my tired veins. They could see it. The impossible, dark anomaly wasn't just a severe psychological hallucination entirely contained within my fracturing mind, it was a physical, visual distortion actively presenting itself to the rest of the waking world. I quickly paid for my items, completely ignoring the nervous, silent cashier who absolutely refused to make eye contact with me, and rushed entirely back out into the freezing, dead night. The sprawling city outside felt incredibly, impossibly abandoned, a dense, oppressive void that actively pushed me toward a complete psychological collapse. As I practically ran down the long, empty sidewalk, the pale moonlight aggressively bleeding through the thick winter clouds, I made the agonizing, fatal mistake of glancing toward the brick wall of a dark alleyway. That was when I noticed it. The shadow was appearing impossibly, terrifyingly taller at night. The dark, featureless projection stretching completely across the rough, cold brick was absolutely not matching my physical human proportions. The entity was towering, its heavy, dark silhouette stretching nearly 10 feet high, its impossibly long, emaciated, spindly limbs reaching entirely up to the second-story windows. It was no longer just a delayed, dark reflection of my earthly body, it was actively, methodically mutating, aggressively taking on a massive, heavy, highly predatory physical shape that fundamentally defied the immutable laws of biology. I completely stopped breathing, my frantically beating heart entirely stalling dead in my tight, cramping chest. I walked completely perfectly, rigidly still back to my apartment, entirely consumed by the overwhelming, desperate need to simply lock the heavy door and disappear into the absolute pitch-black darkness. For the next 3 agonizing, endless days, I did not turn on a single light. I lived entirely in the pitch-black void, navigating the dark, silent rooms entirely by memory, completely terrified to create the necessary illumination that would actively birth the dark entity back into existence. The heavy, toxic barometric pressure violently saturating the room slowly, methodically began to physically crush me, a profound psychological torture driven by the deafening silence, the complete isolation from the living world, and the overwhelming fear of accidentally turning around. But a human being absolutely cannot survive in total, absolute darkness forever. The ancient, screaming, primitive biological need to see, to visually confirm your physical surroundings, eventually becomes a heavy, hypnotic, invasive compulsion that cannot be ignored. One night, entirely driven by a raw, desperate madness and severe, blinding physical exhaustion, I slowly, meticulously walked into the center of the dark living room. I needed to know. I completely, desperately needed to know if the towering, dark anomaly had finally, silently vanished, or if it was still patiently waiting in the cold ether. I reached out with a violently trembling, pale hand and slowly clicked on the small, dim desk lamp resting on the wooden table. A harsh, pale, sickly yellow circle of light violently pierced the heavy, suffocating darkness, aggressively casting a long, dark shadow entirely across the peeling plaster wall. I stood perfectly, rigidly still in the freezing indoor air, holding my breath, staring intensely at the dark projection. At first, everything appeared completely, flawlessly normal. The shadow was the correct, biological height. It was perfectly, quietly still. I slowly, carefully raised my right arm. A heavy, terrifying second of impossible lag passed in the dead silence, and then, the dark shadow slowly, smoothly raised its right arm. I let out a massive, violently trembling gasp of pure, manufactured relief, completely, foolishly convincing myself that the worst of the psychological nightmare was finally over. But the deeply sickening, mind-shattering twist violently destroyed the final, fragile, clinging remnants of my human sanity. I slowly, deliberately lowered my arm back to my side. The shadow did not. The towering, dark silhouette actively kept its long, unnatural arm completely raised in the air, its featureless, black shape perfectly frozen against the pale plaster. I froze, my pale lips clamped tightly shut. His shadow no longer copies him perfectly. The terrifying, impossible delay had completely evolved into a profound, deeply malicious independence. The entity wasn't just lagging behind my movements, it was actively, thoughtfully hesitating. Sometimes it hesitates, completely pausing for agonizing, heavily pressurized seconds, exactly as if deciding whether to imitate him at all. It was a completely separate, highly intelligent, ancient entity entirely trapped within the two-dimensional plane of light and darkness, actively mocking my fragile, pathetic illusion of control. It was observing me, studying my biological movements, and slowly, methodically learning exactly how to operate entirely on its own. The heavy, hypnotic, deeply invasive paranoia completely shattered my mind, leaving me entirely trapped in a waking, highly pressurized nightmare. I violently smashed the small desk lamp, aggressively plunging the entire room back into the suffocating, heavy pitch-black darkness, entirely terrified to cast another shadow, entirely terrified that the next time I created light, the dark entity would not be attached to my feet at all. The heavy, toxic exhaustion actively overrode my ancient, deep survival instincts, violently pushing me toward a massive, dangerous mental break. The absolute fear of turning around, of casually glancing over my exposed shoulder and physically, undeniably seeing the massive, dark void standing completely upright and completely detached from the floorboards, aggressively kept me paralyzed in the center of the room. I absolutely could not stay in the dark, silent apartment any longer. The oppressive, heavy atmosphere felt exactly like a physical, unyielding coffin slowly closing around my shivering body. I desperately needed the open, expansive air of the outside world, completely hoping that the vast, empty city would somehow dilute the heavy, toxic energy violently saturating my existence. I quietly unlocked the heavy front door and stepped entirely out into the freezing, dead, completely windless night. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. The entire suburban neighborhood was completely, flawlessly abandoned, completely swallowed by the deep, biting winter chill. I walked slowly, meticulously down the absolute center of the dark asphalt street, entirely avoiding the wet, concrete sidewalks. The pale, distant street lamps cast long, distorted pools of sickly yellow light across the frozen ground. I completely kept my eyes strictly locked forward, completely refusing to look down at the ground, entirely refusing to acknowledge the massive, heavy, dark silhouettes that were violently, aggressively stretching and twisting entirely around my moving feet as I passed through the varying angles of illumination. The silence was deafening, a thick, static void that completely lacked any natural, comforting background noise, actively amplifying the frantic, uneven, terrified hammering of my own trapped heartbeat. I reached the very absolute end of the long, dead-end street, entirely isolated from the rest of the sleeping world. A single, tall, humming street lamp stood perfectly, rigidly still in the cold night, casting a perfect, harsh, bright circle of pale white light directly onto the frozen asphalt. The heavy, intoxicating pull of absolute terror actively commanded me to stop. I slowly, agonizingly walked directly into the absolute dead center of the bright circle of light. I completely stopped moving. I stood perfectly, rigidly still, my trembling hands resting completely limp at my sides, my rapid, shallow breath actively forming thick, highly visible white clouds of freezing condensation in the pale light. The cold night air was completely, flawlessly still. I didn't move a single, violently aching muscle. I didn't sway. I didn't breathe. I slowly, agonizingly forced my wide, completely terrified, unblinking eyes to look directly down at the wet, frozen asphalt completely illuminated by the bright street lamp. My dark, heavy shadow was cast perfectly, clearly, and flawlessly in front of my physical body, stretching out into the deep shadows of the distant road. It was perfectly, terrifyingly motionless, perfectly matching my rigid, statuesque posture. I stared deeply, intensely into the black, unyielding void of the projection, entirely waiting for the impossible lag to violently catch up, completely waiting for the heavy, static dread to pass. The silence stretched for an agonizing, heavily pressurized eternity. And then, while standing under a streetlight completely motionless, my physical body entirely frozen in the bitter winter chill, the deeply sickening, completely reality-breaking, absolutely horrifying final movement actively occurred. I absolutely did not move my head. I absolutely did not shift my physical posture. But directly in front of me, clearly and undeniably, illuminated on the freezing asphalt, the narrator watches his shadow slowly raise its head and look directly at him. The realization that the dark anomaly was no longer just a simple, delayed projection completely shattered any remaining hope I had of finding a logical, earthly explanation. Up until that point, I had desperately, pathetically tried to convince my rapidly fracturing mind that I was just experiencing a strange optical illusion, a completely harmless visual glitch caused by extreme sleep deprivation and poor apartment lighting. But this true horror story took a significantly darker, deeply terrifying turn when I finally decided to set up a small digital camera in my bedroom. I desperately needed to know exactly what was happening while I slept. I left the camera recording all night, pointing it directly at my bed and the blank white wall beside my mattress. The next morning, I sat at my small desk in the pale morning light, my coffee growing completely cold as I watched the digital timestamp tick forward on the media player. For the first 2 hours, the footage showed absolutely nothing but my sleeping body, the heavy blankets rising and falling with my slow, rhythmic breathing. But something felt wrong. At exactly 3:14 a.m., the dark shape projected onto the blank white wall beside my bed began to smoothly, quietly detach its movements from my physical form. While my actual body remained perfectly, rigidly still in deep sleep, the dark silhouette on the plaster slowly, methodically sat up. It raised a featureless, elongated arm and seemed to examine its own dark hands. It turned its hollow, flat head toward the camera lens, remaining perfectly still for 20 agonizing minutes before slowly laying back down and seamlessly merging with my resting shape. I still can't explain it. The cold, creeping dread that washed over me was completely paralyzing, proving that this dark entity was actively invading my most vulnerable hours. The disturbing details began to wildly escalate in the following days, moving far beyond simple delayed movements and independent midnight observations. I started noticing that whenever I stood near highly reflective surfaces or strong, artificial lighting, the ambient environment would subtly, terrifyingly alter. One evening, I walked into my small bathroom to wash my face. The bright, harsh fluorescent tubes above the mirror hummed with a steady, mechanical vibration. But the exact moment I stepped in front of the sink, the light in the room noticeably dropped. It wasn't a sudden power fluctuation. The bulbs didn't flicker. Instead, the dark mass of my shadow stretching across the white ceramic tiles seemed to be actively, physically absorbing the light. The edges of the shadow were no longer sharp, defined borders, they were softly fraying, drifting like dark, heavy smoke trapped against the grout. The air temperature in the small room rapidly plummeted, chilling the warm water running over my hands. I stared into the mirror, keeping my eyes locked on my own pale reflection, entirely terrified to look down at the floor. The shadow wasn't just a lack of light anymore, it was a dense, negative presence draining the energy from the space. There were other nights when the shadow would simply disappear entirely, leaving me completely untethered from the physical world. I was walking home from a late shift at the office, taking a quiet, familiar route through a desolate suburban neighborhood. The street was lined with tall, bright, evenly spaced sodium street lamps casting overlapping pools of harsh orange light onto the wet concrete. As I walked under the third lamp, I casually looked down, expecting to see my elongated silhouette stretching out into the dark street ahead. But there was absolutely nothing. Just bare, illuminated, wet pavement. I stopped perfectly, rigidly still. I looked up at the glowing bulb. I looked at the dark silhouette of the mailbox next to me, casting a perfectly normal, sharp shadow onto the curb. I had no shadow. The sheer, unnatural absence of a fundamental physical property made my stomach drop. I felt completely, terrifyingly exposed, exactly as if a vital, protective layer of my existence had simply detached and wandered off into the freezing night. I stood there for 10 agonizing minutes, stepping back and forth under the light, completely devoid of a shadow. But then it happened again. It returned completely unannounced when I finally unlocked my front door, suddenly pooling heavily at my feet in the hallway light. But every single time it vanished and returned, the dark mass looked slightly denser, slightly heavier, and infinitely more menacing. The sensory anomalies aggressively crossed the boundary from visual to auditory. I live entirely alone in a quiet, older apartment building with creaky, original hardwood floorboards. I know the exact, comforting sound my own physical footsteps make in the dead silence of the night. One evening, I was walking slowly down the short, dark hallway leading to my kitchen. I abruptly stopped to check a notification on my phone. The apartment was perfectly, heavily silent. And then, exactly 1 second after I had stopped moving, a distinct sound echoed in the hallway. Tap. Squeak. A single, heavy footstep softly pressed into the wood directly behind my heels. I completely stopped breathing. I didn't turn around. I just stood perfectly still, my heart hammering a slow, painful rhythm against my tight ribs. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps forward. Stop. Tap. Tap. The sound was unmistakably coming from the empty space right behind me. It wasn't an acoustic echo bouncing off the walls. It was the physical, heavy sound of weight pressing into the old floorboards. My shadow was taking extra, independent steps. It was lagging behind my physical movement, but it now possessed actual, terrifying mass. It was walking with me. I slowly, meticulously walked the rest of the way into the kitchen, entirely terrified to break into a run, fully knowing that if I sprinted, the heavy, dark footsteps would chase me down the hall. The psychological isolation was rapidly becoming the hardest, most unbearable part of the ordeal, but the terror reached a completely new, suffocating level when other people began to actively notice it. I was at my office during a late Friday evening, finishing up a delayed project with 2 other coworkers in a small, windowless conference room. The overhead fluorescent lights were incredibly bright and abrasive. I was standing next to a white presentation board, talking through a timeline, when my coworker, Sarah, suddenly stopped writing in her notebook. Her tired eyes slowly drifted from my face to the blank, white wall directly behind me. I watched as her casual, exhausted expression slowly shifted into a look of pure, unadulterated confusion, and then dissolved into a pale, quiet, deeply unsettling dread. She blinked slowly, her mouth falling slightly open. "Are you seeing that?" she whispered, her voice completely lacking its usual confidence. My other coworker slowly turned his head to look at the wall. The entire room fell into a heavy, dead silence. I didn't need to turn around to know exactly what they were staring at. My shadow was undeniably doing something entirely impossible in the harsh light. Perhaps it was standing perfectly, rigidly still while I was actively moving my hands to speak. Or perhaps it was slowly, independently leaning its featureless head toward them. "It looks like, there's someone standing behind you," Sarah stammered, her hands trembling as she pointed a pen at the wall. I immediately stepped entirely away from the whiteboard, forcing a weak, pathetic, highly nervous laugh from my dry throat. I quickly muttered a terrible excuse about the strange angle of the projector lens casting distorted light. I immediately packed up my laptop, my hands shaking, and practically ran out of the building. I couldn't risk them watching it any longer. I couldn't risk them fully confirming the terrifying, impossible truth. After that deeply sickening incident, the nature of my fear fundamentally shifted. I became completely, entirely terrified of both absolute darkness and strong artificial light. I realized that the dark entity attached to me only visually existed when there was a distinct light source to cast it onto a surface. If I was in total, pitch-black darkness, I couldn't see it, but I could physically feel its heavy, cold presence patiently waiting. If I was in bright, harsh light, I was forced to watch it misbehave and assert its impossible independence. My only desperate, pathetic solution was to force my environment into a perpetual, hazy, gray twilight. I frantically drove to the hardware store and bought thick, heavy blackout curtains, meticulously taping them over every single window in my apartment to block out the street lamps and the morning sun. I methodically unscrewed all the bright, clear bulbs in my overhead fixtures and replaced them with the dimmest, lowest wattage amber bulbs I could find. My once comfortable home rapidly devolved into a quiet, suffocating, hazy cave. The ambient light was so incredibly flat, weak, and diffuse that it barely cast any distinct shadows at all. For a few short, agonizing days, this gray twilight brought me a microscopic measure of psychological comfort. I would sit for hours on my couch in the dim amber glow, staring blankly at the floor, deeply relieved to see nothing but the faint, blurry, undefined suggestion of darkness at my feet. But the static silence in the apartment felt completely different now. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of an empty room. It felt incredibly heavy, densely crowded, and highly pressurized. It felt exactly as if someone was standing mere inches away, silently holding their breath in the dark. I completely stopped sleeping in my bedroom, entirely abandoning the space. I slept sitting rigidly upright on the living room couch, keeping a small, heavy metal flashlight gripped so tightly in my sweating hand that my knuckles ached. My severe, unbroken physical exhaustion was actively, methodically breaking my mind, leaving me constantly, frantically analyzing every single dark corner of the room. During those long, agonizing, sleepless nights, my rapidly fracturing mind kept helplessly drifting back to a vague, deeply unsettling piece of folklore I had uncovered during my frantic online research weeks ago. When the terrifying anomaly had first started as a simple, delayed movement, I had desperately scoured obscure paranormal forums and ancient digital archives looking for any similar real experience. Most of the information was completely useless, poorly written fiction. But I had stumbled upon one single, deeply buried, archived post from over a decade ago that stuck in my exhausted memory exactly like a rusted, jagged nail. The anonymous user had frantically described their own shadow moving slowly, lagging behind their steps, and acting entirely independently of their physical body. They had desperately begged the forum for any kind of earthly advice. The only reply on the entire thread was a short, chilling, highly cryptic warning from a completely deleted account. The message simply read, "A shadow is a natural tether. It keeps your physical body anchored to this reality. If your shadow lags, the tether is simply stretching under pressure. But if your shadow ever stops following you, don't turn around." I had easily dismissed it as a creepy, fabricated internet story at the time. But sitting entirely alone in my dim, hazy apartment, constantly listening to the quiet, phantom footsteps pressing into my hardwood floor, those exact words echoed endlessly in my tired head. I didn't completely understand what it meant to turn around. Was I simply not supposed to look directly at it? I had been obsessively looking at it on the walls and the floor for weeks. But then the terrifying realization hit me. I had always kept the shadow in my peripheral vision, or looked at it projected onto a surface in front of me. I had absolutely never physically turned my body to directly face the empty, physical space immediately behind my back when the shadow was actively misbehaving. I had always subconsciously treated it like a two-dimensional projection, entirely ignoring the physical space it occupied. The absolute climax of this waking nightmare arrived on a freezing, completely desolate Tuesday night. A severe, unprecedented winter storm had rolled into the city limits, bringing heavy, blinding, freezing rain and fierce, howling winds that battered the exterior of the old building. The ambient temperature rapidly plummeted, and the old wooden architecture heavily groaned and settled against the chaotic weather. I was sitting completely still in my usual, defensive spot on the living room couch, tightly wrapped in a heavy blanket, staring blankly at the blank wall opposite me. The dim, weak amber lamp beside me began to softly flicker. And then, accompanied by a loud, mechanical, deafening pop from the overloaded street transformer down the block, the entire municipal power grid failed. The entire apartment was instantly plunged into absolute, pitch-black, suffocating darkness. All the comforting, ambient background noise of the humming refrigerator and the rattling heaters died instantly, swallowed by the heavy void. The only sound left in the entire world was the chaotic rain lashing against the thick glass of the windows. I froze completely. I didn't move a single, aching muscle. I just sat perfectly, rigidly still in the dark, my frantically beating heart hammering a slow, painful, terrifying rhythm against my tight ribs. I waited in the dead silence for my burning eyes to slowly adjust to the profound absence of light. After several agonizing, highly pressurized minutes, a faint, pale, sickly ambient light began to slowly filter into the room from the full moon occasionally breaking through the fast-moving storm clouds outside, casting a cold, gray, highly distorted glow across the living room floor. I slowly, incredibly carefully lowered my terrified gaze. I looked directly at the hardwood floorboard exactly beneath my resting feet. I noticed something that instantly made my blood run entirely cold, stopping my breath dead in my throat. There is no shadow beneath me anymore. The faint, pale moonlight was actively casting long, dark, sharp shapes from the edges of the couch and the coffee table, stretching them across the patterned rug. But my specific spot on the floor was flawlessly, perfectly empty. For the first time in weeks, the floor behind me is completely empty. The dark, heavy, lagging mass that had been relentlessly torturing my existence was entirely gone from the ground. The sudden absence of the shadow did not bring a wave of relief. It brought a massive, suffocating, paralyzing tide of pure, unadulterated primal dread. The ancient tether had finally broken. I instantly remembered the chilling, archived warning echoing in my mind. If your shadow ever stops following you, don't turn around. I kept my wide, unblinking eyes forcefully locked onto the empty, illuminated floorboards, completely terrified to look anywhere else in the room. The silence in the apartment became absolute, heavy, and deeply predatory. I couldn't hear the chaotic rain outside anymore. I couldn't hear the wind. All I could physically feel was a sudden, massive, freezing drop in the air temperature directly behind the exposed, fine hairs on the back of my trembling neck. The stagnant air suddenly felt incredibly heavy and ancient. I slowly, sickeningly realized that the exact reason there was absolutely no shadow resting on the floor was because it was no longer a flat, two-dimensional projection constrained by the laws of light. The darkness had actively gathered. It had seamlessly pulled its entire bulk up from the flat surface of the wooden floorboards and perfectly assembled itself into the physical, three-dimensional space of my living room. I could clearly, undeniably hear a slow, quiet, highly deliberate rustle of heavy fabric. I could hear the faint, shallow, rhythmic sound of a cold breath that absolutely did not belong to my own lungs. My ancient survival instincts screamed at me to blindly run, to bolt for the front door and throw my physical body into the freezing storm, but my terrified body completely refused to obey. I was entirely trapped in a state of absolute psychological collapse. The crushing isolation, the severe exhaustion, and the endless weeks of slow, creeping fear had finally, completely worn away all my mental defenses. I slowly, agonizingly gathered the absolute last, fragile fragment of my courage. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely feel my own cold fingers. I took a slow, deep, trembling breath of the freezing indoor air. I decided to break the one, final rule. I slowly turned my heavy head. I twisted my rigid body completely around to look directly into the pitch-black darkness. Standing directly behind me is a completely dark human silhouette. Motionless. It possessed no defining features, no reflecting eyes, and no earthly clothing. It was just a dense, absolute, towering void that actively absorbed the faint, pale moonlight filtering into the room. I stared deeply into the pitch-black emptiness of its face, entirely paralyzed, completely unable to scream or move away. And then, in the absolute center of that featureless, heavy void, a slow, thin crack of pale, sickly white slowly appeared. Its face slowly forms my smile. And my shadow was no longer on the floor, because it was standing behind me.